The NBA playoffs are here, and I'm getting my bets in on FanDuel. Talk to me, Chuck GPT. What do you know?
All sorts of interesting stuff, even Charles Barkley's greatest fear.
Hey, nobody needs to know that.
New customers bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets if you win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook.
21 plus and present in Virginia. Must be first online real money wager. $5 deposit required. Bonus issued is non-withdrawable bonus bets that expires 7 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. See full terms at FanDuel.com/sportsbook. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
Hello, everyone. I'm Therese Bottomly, editor of the Oregonian and Oregon Live. This is Beat Check with the Oregonian. Today, I'm talking to several journalists who covered the 2020 protests in Portland, and we'll walk back through some of the highlights and some lowlights. First, Beth Nakamura, a photographer for the Oregonian and Oregon Live, who spent many, many nights on the streets covering 2020 demonstrations. Ryan Fernandez, social media manager who monitored the nightly events via live stream, and Zane Sparling, a reporter who was on the ground in downtown Portland. Beth, Ryan, Zane, welcome to Beat Check.
Nice to be here.
Hello.
Glad to be back.
So May 2020, we were working remotely for the most part as the COVID pandemic had shut down our offices as well as most offices. Little did we know we'd be staffing more than 150 straight nights of protests after the killing of George Floyd by police. The first gathering was May 28th in downtown in front of the Justice Center jail. The next day, thousands gathered in Peninsula Park in North Portland. Hundreds later walked the 5 miles to downtown, and some in the crowd around 11 p.m. smashed windows at the Justice Center jail, and police responded in riot gear. Other vandals then went to Pioneer Place and smashed windows of the Apple Store and other stores. The video of that would play and replay on national stations for weeks. For the first of what would be dozens of times that year, the police declared a riot and 48 people were arrested. On June 1st, the fifth night, thousands of Portlanders lay on the Burnside Bridge to represent the amount of time a police officer knelt with his knee on Floyd's neck. I want to ask each of you about your impressions of the protest, but I would say a pattern developed over many nights. Peaceful protests would change dramatically as the clock neared midnight, with vandalism and confrontations with police beginning about then. Later, President Trump would call in the feds, who took an aggressive stance in downtown. In the third stage, agitators would head out into the neighborhoods, targeting precincts and intent on direct involvement against police. So, Zane, you were on the streets quite a bit during this time. What were your early impressions of the protests?
Well, Therese, if you looked up the word unprecedented in the thesaurus, you probably wouldn't find anything because us journalists just wiped that entry clean, referring to it so many times, trying to find a word that could describe what we were seeing in downtown Portland on those early nights. You mentioned that real storming of the Bastille moment that happened on the first major night of protests. I remember seeing that happen on social media, one of my fellow journalists' accounts, and rushing downtown that first night because much like the police and the sheriff's office, I was caught completely flat-footed. I had no idea what sort of boiling over was about to occur on that first night. And so I wasn't there for the beginning. I got there. I was unfortunately the person responsible for that endless footage of the Apple Store being looted because I got there for that. And I think I was the only journalist who had captured that moment. Portland has so many detractors who talk about lawlessness and chaos. And I think people who actually live in Portland, people who work in downtown Portland, know that by and large that isn't true. Certainly in that first night, for those first couple of hours, it was true. It felt like there had been a complete breakdown of law and order. People were stealing the fake merchandise that Apple displays that doesn't actually work because they don't put real phones out on those tables. But people were not thinking about that in those couple of hours. Other stores, people were riding scooters inside the mall. I mean, it was cinematic in a sense. But of course, those first early nights were unfortunately unprecedented. And it was a real shock to see that, to see just all of the the lights and sounds. I mean, it was overwhelming to be there, and I certainly didn't come into it well prepared that first night. I remember that.
And
I
this
wasn't
led
there.
to the response. Sorry, Beth. This led to the response in downtown of boarding up windows and, the Apple store looking like a fortress for many months after that. I think the rush you were talking about, Zane, the Justice Center jail, people smashed windows, went in, lit a fire. So yeah, that was really a remarkable turn of events that nobody quite foresaw. And Beth, you were going to say your impressions.
Oh, just it's fascinating to hear Zane, because I don't think we've ever talked about this all the intervening years. But yeah, Zane used the word cinematic, and that is my impression of those early days. I wasn't there at the beginning. I was kind of intermittently there, and so for me, it's kind of a little bit of a cinematic montage in a way. And my recollection is more hazy. I do remember that feeling that there was this kind of creeping chaos to it. It all felt less predictable, more uncertain than anything I'd experienced kind of before. And I've certainly, we've all covered a lot of protests here among us, but yeah, I remember chasing, crowds would splinter off, and I remember being with a small crowd that kind of dispersed, and they were kind of heading toward Powell's, so I'm off the grid here, and I can suddenly smell tear gas, and it was just that, like, what is happening? And that was kind of a lingering feeling. I weirdly remember Joanne Hardesty in the early days with a small crowd at what I think was the Federal Park there. I remember what she was wearing, oddly. So little moments like that have stayed with me.
Yeah, and that smell of, the tear gas and the pepper spray and so forth. And I remember watching the splintering of groups running. It was hard to understand the police sometimes when they were broadcasting where to go or where not to go. Ryan, you were monitoring. This was sort of unusual in that there were so many people live streaming from the ground. It provided a way for people in the office or in our living rooms back then, because of COVID, to monitor in real time what was going on and what the dangers were. So, at what point did you realize we need ballistic vests? We need tear gas masks. We need protection here.
Yeah, simple answer to that is early. Like you said, we're going to keep using this word unprecedented. Like, this is something we've never seen before. And so we were like, oh no, what do we do? But after we kind of got over that initial shock, it was like, okay, how are we going to proceed? Because this is going to continue on, it looks like. And so as soon as we, the first journalists we heard, like, oh, there's tear gas, oh, there's bear spray. It's like, we need to buy some sort of protection for them to be able to do their jobs out there. And so I think the gas masks were the first of our buys for as far as gear. And then once the actions down there kind of started to ramp up later, which we'll probably get to, where we started talking about buying those ballistic vests, we started buying helmets, we bought some first aid kits, and it was kind of a shock seeing all that gear. We weren't in the newsroom a lot, but we piled all our gear in the newsroom for photojournalists to go pick up. And years later, that gear was all on the table, and seeing that gear is pretty shocking coming back to the newsroom once we were all allowed to do that.
Yeah, we think of like our iPhone and our pad and pencil, and that's our gear, but now it's a completely different dynamic. We were very concerned about reporter and photographer safety. I know early on we said we had to team up, watch each other's backs, especially photographers, Beth, because you're looking into the camera. I mean, you're not looking around you. So talk about that experience of like you're focusing in on your camera and everything's happening around you.
Right. And, the risk for that is always that, you're not disassociating. That's too strong a word, but you're sort of fixated with what's unfolding. And sometimes that in this chapter of my work life, that could be perilous,
Yeah, there's a debate in journalism, I think, about do you wear the placard that says press or the Oregonian to let people know your role there, or does that make you a target. I know that was debated. I think a lot of the TV stations did not wear their branding, but of course they're carrying bigger cameras. So, generally we were trying to stay out of the way of police. Obviously, we're not trying to get in their way. But Beth, you had an experience where you ended up being shoved by a police officer. Talk about that.
Yeah, that was fairly early on. I would say I was in, I can't even remember the park now. It might have been sort of in front of the federal courthouse. I don't know if anyone recollects. I just remember, and this is the kind of thing that there's a real sweet spot here when you're covering stuff that's kind of escalating. Our whole role is to witness this and be sort of a check on, what's happening and, people in positions of power and that sort of thing. That all plays out on a protest ground. And so you're always kind of on the edge of that, how long do I stay? When is this going to break? And so, that was the situation. Police had kind of entered the park. They had nothing was yet declared, as I remember, though I'd have to look back, but certainly not a riot. And they were pushing, verbally calling people to get out of the park. I was holding up my press pass, repeatedly saying, press, and holding it up and holding my camera up. I started to retreat with everyone else. I turned around so that I could be more focused about it. And I got shoved with a baton that was like in a vertical position. I could feel it. That's how I know. Like he was holding it in his hands and just shoved me with that pole and pushed me, and I kind of tumbled. I didn't fall to the ground, but it caused me to stumble. And then this is the part that, I think the public experiences this stuff very differently, or I think they did, than how I experienced it. I think for the public, it was perhaps, this is a kind of a sort of known person working for a traditional outlet, and her rights were disregarded. For me, sure, that's true, but it was more like I was physically violated and I was kind of doing everything right. And what I remember, and I don't even think this is a public thing, and it's very small, but it's something I remember, which is that he took one of his digits, a thumb or index finger, and he had like a glove on, and he shoved me really hard with the finger. And I just distinctly remember feeling like, what am I, a cockroach here? Like I remember just like that specific action on his part just felt incredibly demeaning. And then that was it. It took on a life of its own, and I had moved on. Yeah. Not interested in becoming the story, and inadvertently had become the story. And so I just kind of learned my lesson there. But I didn't want that to happen. I didn't go public with it. Someone posted it on Facebook who had seen or heard about it, and then it took on a life of its own. And, I sort of regret that, honestly. But.
And Zane, you also had a similar experience of being, I think there's another famous video related to Zane spiraling beyond the Apple store, of you being shoved to the ground. To talk about that.
Yeah, I guess I wish I could say like Beth that, it was just somebody else who posted that, but I posted it myself. So I have no defense for making myself at least a tiny bit of the story. It was, like our valiant photojournalist said, something that I tried to move past. As you mentioned, Therese, we had a lot of discussions about how to identify ourselves, knowing that wearing a bright giant press badge is, in a sense, a target around our necks. And so trying to look professional, trying to look not like a protester, but also maybe not, wearing neon orange and saying, hey, if you want to go mess with somebody who's not a cop, come up to me. That was a very fine line. Beth Nakamura, of course, is a style icon, but it was always funny when other journalists would show up who had like all black was just sort of their style. And so they would show up wearing their normal clothes, and it'd be like, great, you look like, an Antifa super soldier right now. Go on.
Yeah. And Ryan, from your perspective, watching the streaming, there was a blurring of the lines a bit, some intentional and some just real, in terms of the quote unquote legacy press versus, street press, or then after a judge gave added protection to the press, a lot of people started slapping press on their hats and their backs. So talk about kind of what you were seeing when you were looking around on social media for legitimate sources of information.
Yeah, so like I said, it was my job to be the guy in the chair back at my apartment in my sweatpants while these guys were out there doing the tough work. But I was tasked with kind of monitoring social media to keep tabs of what's going on and assist them in any way I could. And back then, the way to do that was on Twitter. And this was, 2020 before it became X and all that stuff. And journalists were posting pretty much everything they were doing on X or Twitter. And it was a great help for us to kind of coordinate our people in the field. And that was complemented by Twitch streams, which is, if you don't know what Twitch is, it's a live streaming app that is mostly used by gamers to stream themselves playing games and talking to their fans and whatnot. But a lot of, I guess we're calling them independent press people, started streaming on Twitch, and they weren't affiliated with any outlet or major media news company or anything. They were just people out there with phones or whatever, and they would stream what they saw. And it was extremely helpful for us to keep tabs on different parts of the city where we weren't. And also for me to be able to see my people on my field sometimes. I would catch them on the streams and I would be able to direct them, go here, don't go here, it's not safe over here, retreat, come back, things seem calm, everyone take a break. And yeah, there was quite a large group of streamers. I don't know what they're up to nowadays, but they were very helpful for us.
Yeah, they were very active and out there pretty much every night. And you're right, when it turned into that, going into the neighborhoods phase, it was helpful to be able to look in real time at what was happening in different places of the city. So now, the Justice Center's all boarded up. And then things changed somewhat dramatically when the feds come in. President Trump, was particularly frustrated with what was going on in Portland, what he was seeing on broadcast news, even though it was pretty limited to a few blocks of downtown at that point and was pretty limited in terms of late at night, that you could see from the portrayal of it that things were out of hand. So he ordered the feds to come in, and that made things take kind of a dramatic turn. Beth, I'm thinking about as a photographer, you want to be in the front of the action. And I remember photos and video of a line of, law enforcement in riot gear standing in front of buildings. And we're telling you, stay to the back, make sure you have an exit route. I mean, those are really competing tensions, but it really
Correct.
did change and ramp up once the feds came to town.
Yeah, I think before the feds arrived, things, we had probably 10,000 people out on the street in those, not the very beginning, but those early months. That receded, and then we would have, maybe 200 or so people who were kind of doing their more harmful or destructive type actions late at night. That's what it had come to at a certain point. And that's when the feds arrived. And when that happened, we were back to the numbers that we saw in the early months, 10,000 people back downtown. So it's sort of, it caused more from their perspective, caused more problems than it solved in terms of trying to, snuff this out. It had the opposite effect. And at that point, it felt like the whole city was up in arms about, what a perceived kind of invasion into, this, quirky little place that everyone loved and called home. That's what it felt like over time.
And Zane, you were down in that zone. So we got the Justice Center jail boarded up. You got the federal building right next to it. You've got the county courthouse, the parks. I mean, really, that was a bit of a disaster zone.
It was. And I have such a vivid and, in my mind, hilarious memory because back then I worked at a different newspaper, right? So things were a little bit different for me. But, of course, I knew Beth and all of the great journalists at the Oregonian. Ryan Fernandez, I knew as his Twitter icon, but I mean, there was And so sometimes I would be going to protests, and you naturally have lots of conversations with the other journalists there. And I just remember one day I was walking over toward the metal siege fencing that had been put up around the federal courthouse, and somebody just like whips in with their car and parks like, I would say, about a block and a half from this siege, and in a legal parking spot, mind you. And it's just Beth getting out like, oh, yep, here for work today. You know what I mean? Like, I think I was like hiding my car, farther away because I was concerned that maybe, something would spread or something would happen. Right. And Beth was just doing curbside delivery protest journalism. I don't remember what night that was, but it was a fun memory.
Beth, you talked to other journalists about like becoming a combat photographer in your own city. Right, you were like,
I think that's true.
Almost a war zone at times. Yeah,
yeah, I think that's true. I think it kind of happened over time. It wasn't a realization that just kind of hit me. It was like a lobster in a pot. It's cold at first and warms up, and over time, pretty soon you're boiling, and you don't realize it. And I think that was the case here. I say it's not a great feeling, but it's true. I became a conflict photographer in my city. That is true. I wore a bulletproof vest. I got, all of us did. It's certainly not just me. This is my experience.
I remember one march where you looked up and there was a person with a rifle or a gun on the balcony watching the marchers.
Correct. That was in, I believe, Southeast Portland, just from his apartment balcony. And it was, totally normalized. Like, there's a guy with a gun. We should kind of, let's keep an eye on him. Let's see if we can kind of, document this. I mean, it was all in a day's work.
We did have a photographer injured, one of your colleagues. He was hit in the thigh with a police munition. There certainly was a difficulty with police when they started firing or sending, warnings and started rushing. There wasn't a lot they could do or we could do to say other than hold up your press badge, obviously. But you guys also had some difficulties with the protesters. I mean, talk about that a little bit, where they weren't that happy with their with the work of the journalists and documenting what they were doing.
We were kind of everybody's whipping boy at a certain point, and I think if the police hadn't arrived yet, then we're the target, and once the police arrive, all eyes are on that, and they become the enemy. So it kind of, the dynamics really shifted depending on what was happening around us. But certainly, yeah, we were not anybody's friend out there. Most people didn't want us out there, and they would dress up like us and wreak all kinds of havoc on the sort of lines that are typically drawn that became blurred and at a certain point just entirely unrecognizable. I don't know what your experience was, Zane. I'm really curious.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly a nuanced discussion. I think that as journalists, we are ethically and I think professionally committed to just showing people what happens, being objective observers, not, letting the facts come to us rather than imposing a narrative. Right. The protesters often felt like any sort of documentation could be used against me in a court of law. And certainly, I don't think any journalist, a self-respecting journalist, sees themselves as merely a surveillance camera, right? We aren't an extension of the state. Our goal is not to, our goal is not just simply to be another camera, right? I mean, we want to take photos and videos that matter, that help explain things, rather than, say a surveillance camera that captures the face of every single person who walks by. I mean, that's just not the goal of a normal journalist. But it led to some tensions. And it certainly led to journalists getting less than positive reviews at times, especially online. In person, it could be even more dangerous because, someone might decide to give you a review with their fist, and stuff like that did happen. We all had to take precautions. I know that for myself, as someone who was not primarily a photojournalist, my solution was, I'm going to write an article I'm going to describe what happens, objectively, and I'm not going to worry about getting the photo from the front lines. Certainly not every night, because there was a lot of danger getting hit by police munitions, getting pushed over or stumbling in a giant chaotic crowd.
And Ryan, you probably saw some of this anger toward the media on social media, where people were thinking that we were an arm of law enforcement by documenting what protesters were doing.
Yeah, as the social media guy, I got to read all the comments on Twitter, and that's not always a fun job, but it was helpful. We got some feedback, and we took that feedback and kind of tried to implement it. The thing that people didn't see is, like, every day before the protest started, we would gather as a team and kind of discuss, okay, what went right, what went wrong, what are we doing, what can we change, how are we out there? Are we covering this the best way we can? Are there different angles we could look at? And I think a lot of people saw the dramatic photos of the fire and the fireworks and everything and the tear gas clouds, and they're instantly like, that's what that protest was. It was all that. But there was a lot of standing around waiting for things to happen, I would say. The protests at the beginning would start out large gathering, hanging out. Damian Lillard was down there. The Raging Grannies were down there. And, people were fired up, but it was mostly this like chanting from what I saw. Again, I wasn't there. But from what I saw, it was mostly this chanting, hanging out. And then, the tone would shift. And those people like Damian Lillard would leave for good reasons, obviously. And so I think a lot of the feedback we got on Twitter and whatnot was like, how can you call these peaceful protests? But most of the content that got spread around was the dramatic stuff. And so there was a dichotomy of like what people are saying versus the full story. It was like, if the protest night was 80% peaceful and 20% chaotic, they saw that 20%. They're like, oh, this is crazy. And it was crazy, but that wasn't the whole story of the evening.
Right. We really saw the role play out here of social media and algorithms, just the role of tech, frankly, in kind of having the wheel of journalism in a way. I mean, it was really frustrating to have. I'm from the East Coast, so I had countless conversations with people who had an entirely different perception of Portland than any one of us did. And you can't, people are committed to their narratives, and it's really hard to penetrate that. And that's very frustrating. And that, the role of social in the news and information ecosystem continues to play out in problematic ways. But
even as simple as what Beth, as a crop. I remember one particularly like gnarly looking fire, and people were saying, why didn't the Oregonian report on this? And then we looked at the photo, and it was like, if you pulled back, it was a metal can that had a small fire in it. And it was nothing like what it looked like on television. So I think that was difficult. And I'm not saying we got 100% right in responding to it or helping people understand what was happening, but like many of you probably got the East Coast relatives saying, are you okay? Is Portland, is it safe? Because there was a very different perspective if you were not in the city. So it turned deadly then, unfortunately, in late August, almost the last day of August. A pro-Trump caravan came downtown with folks in pickup trucks with flags waving. And that night, a self-described Antifa member shot and killed one of the Trump rally goers, Aaron J. Danielson. And video of that incident made it clear that many people on many sides were carrying firearms to these protests. And that was really a devastating night with some dramatic photography. And really, I think everybody was shocked by that. But the protests continued for weeks, even as numbers dwindled. And then over Labor Day, devastating historic wildfires broke out around the state. And the unrelenting pace of news continued until 2020 was in the record books. We're going to put links to some of these stories in the episode notes, but with that, we'll call it a wrap. Thanks so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. Tell a friend, help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is with a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.